Welcome back to Soft Spoken Storytime, Episode 5, continuing on with SCP-001 Ouroboros, Chapter 3. Clicked on. More information will come to you as I receive it. There is a dark room under a mountain in the far north where a man stands pressed against a corner. Something is spinning in the center of that room, something dark. He screams out his daughter's name before his body is pulled from the wall and into the darkness. There is an explosion, and the room collapses. Years earlier, the man lies broken in an alley, the fire escape he had dropped from still ringing from the shock. Inches away from his grasp, a little girl looks at him with horror in her eyes, as she is approached by something that moves toward her slowly, one hand outstretched, and fluid leaking from its empty eyes. The man reaches for the girl, but his body fails him. He is forced to sit and watch as the rotted corpse of a thing that might have been a man pulled the little girl into pieces. She screams until the thing removes her face, and then they disappear. It is 1979. A breach of containment occurs involving a low-level reality bender who had killed 3 people in a car prior to being contained by filling their lungs with liquid mercury when they wouldn't let him pass during a traffic jam. The reality bender is shot and killed by Dr. Kelvin Desmet, who later investigation would show was defending himself when the entity attacked him. There was, however, no surveillance footage found of the incident, and although the incident took place several floors up, the entity's containment cell seemed to have been broken into from the outside. The investigation clears Dr. Desmet, who returns to work. A man lingers on the edge of darkness for just a moment. His body is broken and his eyes burn. He sees the face of a little girl, her eyes bleeding and her hair being pulled back into the black maw of a dead-eyed corpse. He screams her name, but he makes no sound. The vision fades, and suddenly he sees infinitely many little girls, some of them dying, but many more alive, growing old and never having to watch as she is consumed by a monster while her father watches, unable to do anything but weep. He sees the monster, the dead-eyed thing, and traces a line in the air between the world he had left and another world, a world of filth and corrosion and death. He sees, if only for an instant, the thread between the two, a glowing fiber that draws them together. He looks past that thread and sees others, hundreds of thousands, millions, trillions, a number stretching towards infinity that he grasps all at once, and then he follows them down, back down toward his world. In his mind's eye, he cuts the threads. Years later, the man sees the threads again, though not now from the eyes of one tumbling into the darkness. Instead, he sees them from the eyes of a serrated knife. In the moment before he is dragged back into a cage, he reaches out and grabs not just the threads, but the spools where those threads originated. With one deft motion, he pulls across them, splitting them and emptying their contents into the void beneath him. The threads disappear. He smiles. The next morning, a note had come from within SCP-1322. The translated message was simple. What have you done? The cost of what they had done, i.e., everything in Chapter 3, became evident immediately. 100 sites, large and small, all reported apparent abductions of valuable artifacts and entities. So many reported, in fact, that the Foundation's central computer determined they were experiencing a dominance shift and began making preparations to move the records into deep storage. The order was quickly rescinded by Overwatch Command, who later issued a single line of text as an acknowledgement of what had happened. The Foundation is currently experiencing unexpected shifts in reality. Do not panic. This did little, however, to assuage the fears of those who had watched as living anomalous entities had been crushed under the weight of something inconceivable into infinitesimally tiny points before disappearing altogether. Even worse, perhaps, were those who had watched their coworkers experience the same. Hundreds reported to site infirmaries around the globe. Dozens were dead, disappeared as if pulled by string into another place. The news that morning was undisturbed, save for a few stories that might interest someone with insight. There was an explosion at a chemical plant near Istanbul, though investigators to the scene found nothing except a scorched foundation, a few overturned semi-trucks, and a banner that read, Dr. Wondertainment, Inc., 1 million safe man-hours. Billionaire Skinner Marshall had begun a massive sell-off of his holdings, creating a panic in East Asian money markets. The Secretary-General of the United Nations had announced the sudden and tragic death of long-serving Undersecretary-General D.C. Al Fine, who had perished when her private plane had gone down over the North Atlantic. These and other stories littered local and national news the world over, but aside from a few strange incidents and unusual disappearances, nobody seemed to notice. It is earlier. Around a table sit 13 people. One of them puts her head in her hand. It still means the ends of so many lives. It's too many to even comprehend. A number without limit. Another voice answers. A number without us. There is silence, and then another. We pledged ourselves to maintain normalcy and protect our world, this world. The affairs of other worlds are their own. We would expect any other overseer council to act the same way, in the interest of their universe. This, all of this, the science, the militarism, everything, all of it is to accomplish a single unreachable goal: keep the monsters tucked out of sight. Now we find out even that might not be enough, that the end of days is coming for us anyway. But we're given an option. If we do nothing, every universe dies screaming. If we take this action, every universe dies screaming but ours. Once it's over, it's over. Everything we've struggled for, everyone who has died to protect our world will be validated. Is the end of our road not worth this? Is protecting ourselves from the doomsday to come not worth this? 059 shakes her head. You're mad. You're all mad. You've lost your minds. You know nothing about this entity, nothing about what it's capable of or what it wants, and you're willing to open the only box we've found to put it in? What has happened to you? She stands. You are good men, intelligent men, some of the finest men and women I've ever known. But this is madness. I cannot allow it to happen. Even if we manage to somehow survive turning loose an unpredictable monster, remember today as being the day we gave up our mission. We secure and we contain. Those two come first. We've now risked everything for the faintest glimmer of hope that we somehow achieve the last. And I fear it will have damned us. She pauses. Why do you trust it, Brahmaman? After all we've achieved, why do you risk everything on this? There is a rustling sound from a dark corner of the room. 051 speaks, but something is strange about his voice. I knew Calvin Desmet years ago, in a different life. He wasn't recruited by the Foundation. He volunteered. He was part of a team contracted by the insurgency to run trials on new technology they were developing at the time. But he had a young daughter that was killed by SCP-106 when it breached containment during transit in 1975, years before we had developed functional containment procedures for it. And after that, he sought us out. He never said much about it, but you could tell. If that's him in there, and he had found a way to remove every trace of the anomalies from our universe, no matter the cost, he would do it. I know he would do it. I can hear it in his voice. 059 spits. In another life, you might have been reasonable. This is unacceptable. The rustling stops. From that dark corner, a man slumps forward onto the ground. His throat has been slit. He is 051. The rest of them react with a start. 053 turns and draws a weapon. Who? He says, but is cut off when another figure emerges from the shadows. It is 051. He is shaking and his face is streaked with tears. One arm appears to have been crushed. I'm sorry, the man says, his voice now trembling. I'm sorry. It said that if I came here and I told you, it would spare my life. It would spare... A gunshot rings out through the chamber. Smoke floats from the barrel of a gun in 053's hand. Inches from 051's face, a bullet hangs in the air. The space around it appears strangely distorted. In seconds, it collapses into a point and disappears. 051 turns toward 053, his face warped with fear. Don't you see? His words are panicked. Don't you get it? You didn't contain him. You just put off the inevitable. He told me that my world would be spared, that I would be spared if I could just convince... Liar! 059 shouts across the room, and she too pulls a gun. Another shot rings out, and she slumps over at her desk, clutching her throat. 053 is pointing his gun at her, but he's staring at 051. His eyes are wide. Do you trust him? 051 smiles, but behind the smile is terror. No! He will stop at nothing to achieve what he wants. He has power, unlike any I've ever witnessed, but he's still a person. There's something inside him that still thinks. He promised that he would spare us. He swallows hard. I don't want to die. 051 turns back toward the rest of them. I propose a vote. The utilization of the SCP-001 entity to stave off the end of the world. All in favor? There is silence for a moment. Then, together, 8 voices speak. Aye. 051 nods. Those opposed? 4 voices, including one choking through blood to do so, answer together. Nay. 053 stands. He paces around the chamber, stopping at 3 desks. Every time he stops, there is a gunshot. 3 bodies hit the ground. He pauses at a 4th, where 059 sits leaning against her chair, gun in her hand. For a moment, their eyes lock. Whatever comes next, he says, his voice catching. It is no longer your battle to fight. 059 glares at him with purified vehemence. She opens her mouth to speak, and through blood and bile she says 2 words. Spare me. With a deft motion, she pulls her gun under her own chin and squeezes the trigger. The chair behind her is sprayed with gore as her consciousness is snuffed out. 053 continues to stand over her, unmoving. 051 speaks. 0513 abstains. The measure passes. The rest of them stand and leave the room. 051 is second to last, and 053 lingers a moment longer. 5 bodies stand in silent testament to their opposition. The room goes dark. Gunsmoke hangs in the air. It is after. 053 stands before the shattered glass of an observation deck. Below him is a machine, furiously humming as it spins and twists around a nebulous cloud of darkness. Behind him is a smear of blood, where 051 had been. Moments before, he was no longer. The structure around him creaks and groans, and small rivulets of water from the river above them now leak through the walls. Without looking away, he speaks. Netzek, can you hear me? A low electronic voice responds. Yes. You aren't fitted with any sort of personality module, are you? I am not. He sighs. The rest of the staff had been evacuated. He was the only one left. The rest of the overseers had fled, burying themselves underground or fleeing through extra-dimensional portals, or, in at least one case, killing themselves. Company would have been nice. How long can we maintain containment of SCP-001 given our current conditions? Netzek responds immediately. Given current conditions, I will be able to maintain stability of the Petrichal Fontaine Array for 119 days, 6 hours, and 47 minutes. Afterwards, the array will no longer have the structural integrity necessary to contain SCP-001. 053 rubs his forehead. Given the information you've gathered about SCP-001, what do you think the odds are that our backup containment protocols will be able to neutralize SCP-001? Netzek pauses. Given information gathered during containment of SCP-001, it is certainty that SCP-001 will be undeterred by current failsafes. Full of good news today, Netzek. 053 sits down against a railing. You need to give me something here. I am unable to provide a sufficiently psychologically useful response. 053 waves his hand idly. Yes, I know that. But you can problem solve, right? You're a problem-solving robot? What would you do in my shoes? Netzek pauses again, and does not respond immediately. 053 notices the lights dim overhead, and somewhere far away he can hear a low, droning noise increase in volume. After a moment it stops. Netzek speaks. All attempts to contain SCP-001 by way of brute force or standard means of containment, short of maintaining the Petrichal Fontaine Array, will fail. SCP-001 has, by methods currently unknown to this system, fused itself with a fundamental essence of the makeup of reality. It cannot be harmed or interfered with physically, as any such force that would oppose it requires the same forces to exist that SCP-001 is now joined to. SCP-001 will breach containment the moment the Petrichal Fontaine Array fails. Netzek pauses a second time. However, it continues, SCP-001 does appear to be a sentient, sapient creature, likely formed out of the death of Dr. Calvin Desmond during an accident within the facility in 1982. While sentient, sapient creatures are often unpredictable and generally unwilling to compromise, diplomacy has historically been an effective means at bridging gaps between the creatures with dissimilar goals and motivations. 053 barks out a laugh. You want me to talk to it? That's my best option? Yes. 053 stands up, still laughing. You were worth the research dollars, Netzach. Honestly, that comment alone was worth every penny. He grabs his coat. How about this? You watch Dr. Desmond. I'm going to go get a drink. And when I come back, I'll go down there and talk to the dark body. It'll almost certainly mean both of our deaths, but it was only a matter of time anyway, wasn't it? He makes a move to the door but hesitates. You know, I've been thinking about that night in the council chambers. About the ones I put a bullet in. Sort of a turn of fortune for them, wasn't it? He laughs again, more quietly this time. When I joined the Foundation, someone told me to remain an atheist as long as I can because I'll see so many gods and they'll all be selling something. But none of them will be the real deal. They said that I'll know the one true God when I see it, and to give that God everything it wants because that's the only thing that matters. He starts walking again. That night, I saw God. That night, God wanted me to shoot 059, and by the sound of it, tonight, God wants to talk to me. So hold down the fort, and I'll be back shortly to speak to him. Does that sound all right to you? Netzach drums out a reply. I am unable to provide a sufficiently psychologically useful response. 053 smiles as he walks out the door. That's what I thought. Part 4. The Way It Ends. By order of the Overseer Council, the following file is Level 6/001. Classified. Unauthorized access is forbidden. Item 001, Level 6 Cosmic Top Secret. Containment Class Esoteric. Secondary Class Principalis. Disruption Class Amida 5. Risk Class Notice 1. Special Containment Procedures. It is imperative of the Overseer Council to establish containment of SCP-001. Description. To know the nature of SCP-001 is to know the nature of the Foundation. For more information, see Document 001-GOI.01-Apparatus. Addendum 001.1. Attached documentation. Enter decryption key. Decrypting. The first man stood alone on the barren field, and in the distance he saw the locked gate beyond which his greatest shame was kept. He turned to the snake, who writhed on its belly like a worm, and cursed it for its treachery. You tricked me, the man said. You led my hand astray, and now we are damned for it. The snake sighed. I gave you knowledge, it said, and with that knowledge you made the choice you made. I could not make it for you. The man cried out. All the same, trusting you was my greatest mistake. No, the snake said. Your greatest mistake was believing you had a choice at all. Access document 001-GOI.01-Apparatus. Should intermittent vengeance arm again his red right hand to plague us? Takiro catalog number SC-001/13-001/01. Document type Summa modus operandi. Dates received NA. Operation status closed. Forward. We, the Delta Command, do hereby set in motion the principles of this document, the summa modus operandi of the Chaos Insurgency. We hold the following to be inescapable truths. The Foundation overseers have altered the fabric of reality for the benefit of their own wicked desires. These alterations are the source of all supernatural activity in our universe. These grievances we hold against them. The 13th Overseer has blasphemed the natural order in his foul contract to stay the hand of death, and has usurped the fragile balance of life and given an impenetrable shield to the horrid adulterers of the Foundation. The 12th Overseer has stolen the wealth of the world to benefit the Foundation's insidious designs, and has taken the fruits of many millions for the purpose of turning those labors against the laborers. The 11th Overseer has spun a circle of lies around the people of this world to protect the Foundation's interests, and has cast a dark eye into the void to gaslight and pervert the true human understanding. The 10th Overseer has kept a dubious record of the Foundation's malfeasances and altered history to suit them, and has mocked truth and reason for the sake of maintaining the Foundation's cruel legacy. The 9th Overseer has betrayed the trust of their fellow man and sworn allegiance to the cancerous council, and has time and time again turned away from the opportunities to strike them down to prolong their greed-riddled intentions. The 8th Overseer has committed wicked acts against the ignorant public with their careless use of nuclear weapons, and was one of the first to breathe life into an organization that should have been butchered in the crib. The 7th Overseer has manipulated innocent populaces to create chaos and destruction for the Foundation's benefit, and has shown nothing but contempt and malfeasance against the innocent and unwitting. The 6th Overseer has surreptitiously used the might of the American military machine to crush the Foundation's enemies, and wrought a tale of never-ending violence and bloodshed that has forever stained this world. The 5th Overseer has warped the very boundaries between space and time to extend the Foundation's cruel reach, and taken dark and horrible secrets from those far-off places to use them to fuel the Foundation's death machine. The 4th Overseer has lulled the nations of the world into believing that the Foundation means them no harm, while working alongside the same treacherous intentions that would see this planet laid to waste. The 3rd Overseer has used mankind's own technologies against them, to act as the all-seeing watcher of the Overseers, spinning a web of eyes that has eroded every last shred of human privacy and decency. The 2nd Overseer is complicit. The 1st Overseer has established a council of monsters and demons that answer at his beck and call. Also he may sit on his foul throne atop the putrid wound of the Foundation, and lap like a dog from its seeping, pestilent orifice. The Overseer's cancerous, anomalous influence on the world is a wound on the fabric of the universe, a wound that festers and cannot heal until the irritant is removed. The 13 Foundation Overseers are the irritant in the wound on our reality. The 13 Foundation Overseers must be removed. By order of the Engineer and of those who stepped down, we stand in defiance of this aberration. We stand in opposition to this blasphemy against nature. We stand insurgent against this chaos. Our path is clear, our vision unclouded. We must clean out the wound. We must let our universe heal. We must destroy the 13 Foundation Overseers. Hereafter, we of Delta Command document the summa modus operandi as transcribed by the Engineer of the Chaos Insurgency. Step 00/13. 0513, the other Overseer. Formerly Dr. Felix Carter, Caucasian male, date of birth unknown, was once a doctor for our research consortium and named the International Academy of Physics and Sciences. Early conspirator of 051, and the individual called the Administrator, supposedly was a bargaining chip used in a deal made with death itself to allow death a seat on the council, while it grossly prolonged the lives of the Overseers. Presumed extremely dangerous. Location is only speculated and considered impossible to reach. Decryption complete. Access log. Chapter 1. At the Precipice. Earlier. The proceedings came to order in the back room of an abandoned Somali warehouse. Calvin sat at the head of a long plastic folding table, quietly picking at a fingernail. At the other end of the table were huddled the 7 members of Delta Command, the High Council of Chaos Insurgency. Calvin had almost rolled his eyes when he'd been ushered into the room. For all their soaring rhetoric, they were still unable to come up with anything more substantial than dusty, old buildings and cheap plastic furniture to conduct their business in. Delta Command, he knew, had been formed by the Engineer to bring together the 7 squabbling branches of what had been once called the Insurgency. Each of the 7 groups sent a representative to Delta, and together they formed the larger resistance. The name was a joke, of course. According to legend, the Engineer had nearly given up trying to coordinate the bickering factions by saying, "Never in history has a more chaotic insurgency been mishandled into existence." The name stuck, though Delta thought that chaotic insurgency wasn't nearly distinguished enough. Thus, the Chaos Insurgency. None of these people liked each other, nor did they care for Calvin. He'd had a distinguished career as a CIA agent, first supporting and later leading larger attacks on the Foundation. He, like all those within the insurgency, knew their place in the world. The purpose of the insurgency hadn't ever been to destroy the Foundation, just act as a check against it. A constant thorn in their side, never allowing the Foundation to become too complacent. If they were focused on the insurgency, the logic followed, they wouldn't be able to do as much damage elsewhere. Thus far, this strategy hadn't planned out, but Calvin was exceptionally good at his job, and was less a thorn and more a hacksaw in the gut of the Foundation. His contributions to the insurgency's goals had brought him swiftly through their ranks, and at one point in the recent past he had been considered as the next member from his faction to join Delta. Shortly beforehand, however, he was accused of mishandling insurgency resources, limited though they were, in a raid on a Foundation site holding several potentially magical texts. Although the investigation against his actions hadn't amounted to anything of note, the incident came at the absolute wrong time, and he was passed over for ascension to Delta, in place of a mid-level bureaucrat who had previously been a junior congressman for the state of New Jersey, Howard Kowalski. Coincidentally, it was Howard Kowalski who spoke first. "Good afternoon, Calvin," the portly man said, balancing a pair of thin glasses on the end of his pointed snout. "We appreciate you, making the trip out here. As you know, we're in the middle of, renovations to Delta Command Headquarters." This was, of course, a joke. Delta maintained that their former command center, the one built by the engineer himself, was being renovated, necessitating the empty warehouses and dingy back alley gatherings of the group. It was a public secret that the building had been leveled by the Global Occult Coalition nearly 3 decades prior, though Delta refused to acknowledge this. "So this will have to do, I think." "Yes." He nodded and tapped a stack of papers against his desk. "I guess what we're most curious about here, Calvin, is this document we hear you've recovered." He leaned forward, the glare from a lamp catching his glasses as he peered over the stack of papers. "The journal. Do you have it?" Calvin nodded. "If you allow me a moment of your time, I promise we'll talk about the journal." One of the other members of Delta, a tall, long-haired woman named Norris, made a sound in the back of her throat. "Don't test our patience, boy. It's hard enough that we had to suffer the journey out here, but I swear to God, if we did it so you could bullshit around with some fake book, I'll have your job." Kowalski laughed nervously as Calvin raised an eyebrow at the outburst. Now, Priscilla," Kowalski said cautiously. "Let's hear what he has to say. Calvin has really done a lot for our organization. I think we can all agree." Grudging nods were had all around. "And I think he deserves the benefit of the doubt here." He motioned Calvin to go on. Calvin picked up his own sheaf of papers and opened it up. "All right, so what you're seeing in front of you is something I've been working on with a few people over the last few months. Call it a statement of purpose. We've been working in conjunction with Dr. Vernon Alderman's lab in Sydney, and the result of his team's work has been troubling. The Foundation's continued testing of unnatural entities and phenomena has exacerbated the problem caused by those same entities. They're itching at a wound. Couple that with the knowledge we gained from Lieutenant Horver's team regarding Scantron anchor calibrations shifts in the last few years, and the evidence is clear." He paused and flipped to the next page. "We're quickly reaching a point of no return." He scanned down further on the page. "Now, our current models estimate that we might not make it out of the 2020s without a major public supernatural event, and then not even another 5 years past that before we start seeing things too big for even the Foundation to deal with. That's not good, and is the reason why we need to address this now. If we wait any longer, we might not be able to do anything of any value." Sylvester Sloan, the oldest member of Delta, hacked out a queer cackle. "Our value comes in inhibiting the Foundation's efforts. What it sounds like you're about to say is that you intend to interrupt them entirely." Calvin leaned back slightly. "More than that, I intend to uproot the Foundation, leaf and stem." A thick silence plopped down over the group, as if someone had just thrown a rotten egg into an elevator. Herman von Grundy, another one of Delta's veterans, was the first to laugh. The rest followed in quick succession. Kowalski tried to keep a straight face, but even he was rubbing his eyes before too long. "Calvin, look, I know you mean well, and you know you've got a lot of respect from all of us, but come on, that's a fool's errand." Priscilla sneered down at him. When you can come up with the money, men, and equipment to destabilize the world's most powerful, secretive, influential agency, you come let us know, and we'll make you king of Shit Mountain. How's that sound? Calvin raised both eyebrows this time and took a deep breath as he flipped further forward in the stack of papers in front of him. To this end, he continued, I'd like to cite the procedures established in the Summa Modus Operandi. Delta fell silent. A few of them looked towards each other, confused. Sylvester Sloane's eyes suddenly became very sharp. Is that so? Hang on now, Dane Blank said, flipping hurriedly through his own papers. What's that? I haven't heard about that. That sounds important. Is it important? Desdemona Vance, the youngest member of the group, pulled a thick, filthy binder from a bag sitting beside her. Cracking it open, she leafed past the instructions to a spot a few pages in and began reading. We hold the following to be inescapable truths. Calvin held up a hand. I'll save you the trouble. This document was written by the First Delta Command at the behest of the engineer himself. If we take this document at its word, then you don't need to destroy the Foundation to destroy the Foundation. You just need to destroy the overseers. Priscilla barked out another laugh, one that was not shared with her fellows. Yes, of course. That will be so much easier. 13 immortal demigods that have no doubt long since buried themselves in spells and witchery. How simple. But Sylvester Sloane was still watching Calvin very closely. The 13th Overseer has assured immortality for the others so long as he sits on the council. You'd have to find him first. Well, you'd have to find all of them at some point, which would be itself impossible, unless you had... His eyes narrowed. Unless you had the journal. Calvin nodded, and reaching into a pocket inside the chest of his jacket, produced a small, blue, leather-bound book, partially wrapped in brown paper. Holy shit, Kowalski said. Where did you get that? Desdemona peered at it quizzically. What is that? Years ago, Kowalski said, we received a report that one of the Coalition's finest agents, some fellow with a weird code name, had been putting together a report about the Foundation overseers, where they live, places they frequent, their habits and activities. In other words, if you wanted to find the overseers, it would be the perfect place to start. I still don't understand, Priscilla said. Don't we keep tabs on the overseers? We know where they are, don't we? Sylvester scoffed. No, we tell our agents we do, and every now and again we'll get some report of one of them passing through and somebody getting a glimpse of them. If we really had to, we could probably come up with the real-time locations of maybe half, a few more if we got lucky. He extended a crooked finger towards the journal. But those overseers aren't why that's important. It's important because it supposedly contains the location of 2 overseers, including the 13th, who have never been seen before, ever. Until that book was written, nobody was sure if they actually existed. Kowalski was furiously rubbing his temples. Okay, slow down. Let me think. He looked over the sheaf of papers in his hands again. All right, so you say you can find them. That's great. That's a good start. But there's more to it than that. The contract. They've got a contract with death, and as long as they've got the contract, they can't die. That wasn't true when the Summa Modus Operandi was written, so that's why it's always been seen as more of a guideline than a hard and fast protocol, because you can't kill death. Calvin nodded. You're right, you can't kill death. But I don't think you have to kill death, though. You just need to break the contract. Sylvester leaned forward, responding now with carefully chosen words. If you wanted to break the contract, you'd need something that could steal someone back from death. You'd need something that hasn't existed in 100 years. Calvin fished back into his pocket and pulled out a small glass vial of clear liquid. He set it on the table with a pronounced thunk. If you could break the contract, what then? Whispers surrounded Calvin. He was suddenly aware of the presence of something great and terrible, something whose furious attention he had immediately gained. In the stillness of the warehouse, behind Arcana and beneath the world above, the presence passed through, and then it was gone. Then, as they had so many times before, Delta dissolved into chaos. Holy shit, Calvin, how did you... What is that? The Foundation was dry. It doesn't matter even if he... It knows. We've said too much already. It would be possible to fulfill the Summa Modus Operandi. Kowalski had given up maintaining any kind of order to the stack of papers, and laid them out idly around him. "Where in the world did you come up with that?" Calvin returned the vial to his pocket. "When we were moving against the Foundation storehouse in Bangladesh, when I was told I was misappropriating insurgency resources," he glared at Kowalski out of the corner of his eye. "This is what we were looking for. It wasn't there, granted, but this," he held up the vial to eye level. "I found this the same way I found the journal. Luck." Sylvester nodded slowly. "If that is what we all here think it is, then I think you're right, Calvin. I think that would do it." He stroked the handful of wiry hairs on his chin. "Do they know you have that?" Calvin hesitated. "No." Desdemona leaned forward. "So what's your plan?" Calvin slid the journal forward and set the vial next to it. "We find every single one of those rotten bastards using this." He pushed a finger down on the journal. "Starting with the 13 and working forward. Once they're in the ground, the Foundation will be without governance and will fall apart. We sweep up the pieces, and with the overseers removed, this world can begin to heal." He leaned back. "Someday down the line, we'll all wake up one day in a world no longer under threat of the supernatural. A world free to choose its own destiny." Kowalski continued to flip through the papers Calvin had stacked in front of him, more slowly now. He paused on one passage and then looked up. "All right, I'm convinced. Our resources are limited. If you'd wanted to attempt this like 20 years ago, we might have been in a better spot to help you." He drummed a finger on the table. "Of course, you didn't have that journal before now, which is really the game changer." Kowalski turned towards his colleagues. "Any of you in opposition to this? If we do this, we have to do it. There's no half-assing it. I'll be the first to admit we're wildly outmatched. But if what Calvin says is true, we've at least got surprise on our side, which counts for something." He nodded. "All in favor?" They all spoke in unison. "Aye." Kowalski turned back to Calvin. "What do you need?" "Now." He had asked for 3 individuals, specialized in experience agents each. The logic was straightforward enough. The Foundation was a massive, inexorable machine. Moving the means of the insurgency against it would fail, as it had time and time before. The insurgency had never quite recovered from being shattered by the Foundation all those years ago, and the squabbling factions and schisms within the group were only barely held together by Delta. Trying to turn that disorder into action would be disastrous. But a group of 4, a group small enough to sneak past the all-seeing eye of the Foundation, might make it work. The insurgency had resources enough to create distractions where they were needed and reinforce the team if necessary. But Delta had made it very clear. Their reach had limits. If the group passed beyond Delta's ability to support them, they would be on their own. The first of them was Anthony Wright, a well-seasoned British agent of the insurgency in his 50s, with a kill list nearly as long as his list of accolades. After Delta came into power, the insurgency had still only been little more than a handful of groups of beleaguered and chaotic idealists, but throughout their history, Anthony had been a voice of reason and direction. He had maintained the original goals of the insurgency and had been looked to for guidance for as long as anyone could remember. Whenever Delta had an opening, it was often thought he would take a seat at the table, but he had always refused the position. The second was a woman, younger slightly than Calvin, but not much. Her name was Olivia Torres, and until a few years prior, she had been known within the anomalous community as the famed anarchist Ivory. Her installations were well known, especially in the 3 Portlands that she had called home. The Foundation long believed that she was active within AWCY circles and had pursued her relentlessly. When they finally closed in, she fled to the insurgency and had started fresh there. The last was Adam Ivanov, which caught Delta by surprise. Adam was young, inexperienced, and was not a good fighter. He was good with computers, a prodigy even, but was next to useless with a gun. Calvin, however, was adamant in his decision. He knew about Adam before Adam had known about him, and had made a series of actions over the past several years that led Adam away from the Ukrainian separatist group he had been involved with, into the waiting arms of the insurgency. Calvin had a history with Anthony and Olivia. He had trained with and fought alongside Anthony for the better part of the last decade, and Olivia had been assigned to him on a handful of raids before his exile. Both responded to his request eagerly. Adam, though, was hesitant. He had taken some convincing. Even still, Calvin could sense a desire in his heart. Adam had spent his youth as a Foundation D class assigned to SCP-610 by virtue of his parents being Ukrainian political prisoners. A raid on the Foundation labor camp had liberated him from the horrors of his captivity, and Anthony had carried him out of danger himself. When the young man heard that his savior was among those who he would serve alongside, he quickly submitted to the request. Thus it was that a scant 3 months later their small ship wrestled against the waves toward a jagged black spear that pierced the stormy waters of the southern Atlantic. Looming with silent malevolence, Calvin stood on the ship's prow as the tower came into view. He could feel the amnestics burning in his mind. He could see the shimmering glow of the tower's anomalous nature. A scar, he thought. "What is it?" he heard Olivia say as she took her place beside him. "It's magic, right? Incognito hazard, maybe?" "No, not a cognito hazard. It's an anti-meme. The Foundation didn't build this. Something else did, a long time ago. Whatever they built it for isn't there anymore, so the Foundation has repurposed it." He laughed. "How do you escape a prison you don't even realize you're in? Or in our case, how do you find something that isn't on any map? That can't even be on a map?" Olivia shrugged. "I was wondering the same thing. How'd you find where this was?" Calvin produced the small blue journal. This was the personal journal of someone who had studied the overseers and their methods for decades. He flipped it over and back. It sat in a box for years before somebody realized what it was. When Skidder Marshall picked it up, he realized he'd struck gold. "So how much did it cost?" Calvin shrugged. "Nothing, I stole it." Olivia nodded and looked back toward the tower. "It's beautiful in a way, otherworldly." "It is." A wave smashed against the side of the ship, surging up in front of them in a blanket of freezing sea foam. Calvin instinctively reached out to shield her. Olivia stepped back, but gave him a smile. The muted whine of the foghorn rose up behind them. Calvin turned and hurled himself up the stairs to the wheelhouse. There, Anthony Wright gruffly tugged at the wheel, in between taking long, hard puffs from the fat stogie that dangled out of the side of his mouth. "This is stupid, Calvin," Anthony said, furiously chomping on the cigar. "There's nowhere to land. I haven't even been on a ship in 16 years. This was your plan?" Calvin squinted at the tower. The amnestics would only last so long. Afterward, they wouldn't even be able to perceive the tower. This had to be quick, and the seas were not helping. "The entrance is above," Calvin pointed toward an opening in the rocky face. "Think you can get us up there?" Anthony looked at him like he was mad. "I'll get something up there. I hope you don't need the boat afterwards." Calvin slapped him on the back and grinned. "There are always more boats." Anthony rolled his eyes and spun the wheel, bringing their ship around. "The next swell, we're going to run it. Tell them to hold on down there, because the only way we get this done is by wrecking the boat. You get that right? This'll wreck the boat?" Calvin nodded. "All right then, let's wreck the boat." Calvin scurried down the stairs to find the others. Olivia and Adam were in the hallway. Adam looked ready to vomit. He grabbed them both and pulled them toward the galley, shoving them toward a pillar. "Stay here and hold on." He turned to go back up, just as the ship slammed into a massive wave with the force of a thunderclap. The whole vessel lurched down, up, then forward. For one instant, Calvin could feel his gut squeezing out of his throat, pressing behind his clenched teeth. By the time he reached the top of the stairs, the ship's hull was screeching. Iron and wood grinded across harsh, merciless stone. The hull went on to make several undignified creaks and pops, then came to a stop. Calvin stumbled up to the deck. The boat was now fully docked inside the tower's entrance. Behind them, the ocean continued to rage. Adam was the first to crawl out behind Calvin, but only so he could heave the contents of his stomach over the rails. Anthony, who by some miracle remained mostly dry, walked down past Adam, unlatched the anchor, and threw it over the side. It made a dull metallic thunk as it slammed into dry rock. "Land ho," he announced. Adam wiped spittle away from his mouth with the back of his sleeve. "Madness! You are mad! This is madness! I can barely... This whole place makes me dizzy." He tried to stand, tumbling backwards. "You people, you old people, you're on your way out. I've got my whole life ahead of me, and you crash us into the side of a mountain? Very considerate." He turned back to the railing and heaved again. Calvin patted Adam on the back. "Patience, Adam. You'll stay here with Olivia and Anthony. I'll go alone." He looked back to Anthony. "Make sure nobody follows me." Anthony nodded. Remember what I told you. Don't trust a word. They'll say anything. Lie through their teeth. Be careful. Calvin reassured the older man with a clap to the shoulder. I will. I'll need you, all of you, very soon. But this part, I can handle this alone. Calvin leapt over the railing and down to the stone below. The entryway narrowed into a tunnel. He followed the passage into the darkness ahead. It ended at a freight elevator after 40 meters. He could still hear the distant roar of the ocean echoing off the smooth stone walls. In the dim light, Calvin could barely make out deep cuts in the stone, almost like lacerations. He pulled the iron railing open, stepping inside and hitting a button. Just before it started down, it occurred to him that the entrance looked like it had been smashed into the tower rather than cut. He could not say how long the descent took. After a few minutes, the smooth metal of the shaft gave way to rock. The elevator's interior grew cold. He could make out the faint sound of something beating below. Calvin reached into his pocket and touched the vial, reassuring himself it was still there. The elevator stopped. The carriage shuddered and, with a groan, the gate slid open. He had arrived in a massive chamber lit by torches, each burning with a smokeless emerald flame. The walls were carved with ancient runes that spiraled up into a yawning darkness. The same darkness yawned beneath his feet. Nothing stood between it and him, save the elevator and a steel-segmented walkway extending out from it. The walkway reached the center of the chamber. There, a column of stone rose up out of the pit. When Calvin took a step toward it, a pebble glanced off the side of his boot and fell below. He waited to hear it land. 2 minutes later, he stopped waiting. He crossed the chasm across the walkway. His footfalls were the only sound he heard, save one, the soft beating that came from below. As he drew close to the dais, he could make out its solitary occupant, seated on a small plain metal folding chair, bound to it by thin gold chains, was a human corpse. Calvin opened his mouth to speak, but was interrupted by a sound. It was like a stale rattle, a horrid, empty noise. It filled the room like a chorus, echoing off the walls. It was laughter. Mocking laughter. He approached the corpse, examining it. Hollow, rotted sockets were all that remained of its eyes. Despite this, it stared at him with a fierce intensity. He felt the familiar chill again. Suddenly, the beating below stopped. A visitor. The corpse's mouth did not move. Nevertheless, a voice creaked out from it like a draft through a tomb. How peculiar. I don't often receive guests. Calvin hesitated. You're 0513, correct? That wretched laugh spilled out again. In a sense, this body was once that of Dr. Felix Carter. The meddler. He was the 13th. I reside here in his place. Calvin nodded. So yes, then. Good. You will commune with me. I have come to renegotiate your contract. Something flashed across his vision. He saw endless fields of corpses, fire and blood. He saw a parade of red horrors and a silent figure watching him from above. Calvin shook his head and looked away. When he turned back, it almost looked like the corpse was smiling. You have no authority here, Calvin Lucian. Calvin stepped back in shock. Yes, I know your name. Yours is not one of the 13 penned on the contract. Your hand cannot break it. Calvin collected his nerve. You're right, it's not. But humor me, if you would. Your contract, what are its terms? What were you promised? Somewhere inside the corpse, something growled. Fine, no harm in humoring the soon-to-be dead. The contract offered an escape for the 13 from the hand of fate. Life everlasting. They already found the Fountain of Youth. Why did they need you? The fountain had run dry. Even then it could not save them from me. Only keep me at arm's length. When they began to die, the first came to me to bargain. In exchange for a seat at the table. The rotted voice laughed again. It was a simple negotiation. Calvin walked behind the corpse. His eyes traced the sigils along the walls that surrounded them. And as part of the contract, they gave you this man? Gave you his life? No. His life was insured as part of the contract. They gave me his body. He lingers on the edge of death eternally. His mind is given to the sublime ecstasy of near death. Calvin cocked his head sideways. He's not dead. The corpse scoffed. No. Calvin pulled the vial from his pocket and pulled out the cork. Good, drink up. He reached out from behind the corpse, seizing it by the chin. With just a squeeze, he forced its mouth open. With the other hand, he emptied the contents of the vial into the pit of its throat, taking care to ensure not a drop was wasted. When the vial was empty, he released its face and stepped in front of it. "What was that?" its voice hissed. "Where did you get that? How did—" The change was immediate. Color rushed back into the corpse's face. Blood surged through its body. Fresh pink tissue filled the gaps where its skin had flaked away. Glistening knobs of white swelled up into its sockets. The emaciated torso spasmed, then expanded. The corpse lurched upward as it took in a gasping, choked breath. A violent, painful coughing spasm forced ages of collected dust to evacuate its lungs. Its arms lunged down to grab its chair. In the span of only a minute, the corpse had become a nude man. The convulsions began to settle. His eyes, hazel gold and now filled with fear, darted back and forth. "What have you done?" he shrieked, his voice hoarse from disuse. "What have you done?" Something dark and silver began to seep out of the man's eyes, nose, and mouth. It was like smoke, but thicker. It shimmered in the air above him like a cloud. His eyes rolled back towards the shape. He cried out like a panicked animal. "No! Don't leave me! Don't leave me! Don't!" Calvin leveled his gun at the man and squeezed the trigger. He buried one slug in his temple, then another in his heart. Dr. Felix Carter jerked away with a final gasp. His body slumped into the chair. His head fell back. He stared into the darkness above. Calvin grabbed the back of the metal folding chair and dragged it to the edge of the dais. With a firm shove of his foot, he pushed the chair, along with its occupant, into the pit below. There was a brief clatter of chains, then nothing. Calvin felt the presence again. When he turned, he found a silver woman, draped in darkness, standing alongside him. She peered into the abyss. Her eyes looked sad. "The living body of the 13th, she said. "The contract is invalid. I am released from my obligation." Calvin swallowed and nodded. "Should fatal peril come to them, you will no longer stay your hand against the other 12? "I will not." She did not look away from the pit. "They are free to die." Calvin sighed. "Good, that is enough." He turned back to the elevator, taking a step. Something made him pause. He looked back to the pale figure, struggling with the question he wanted to ask. "Why didn't you stop me? You have the authority and power to do so. Why did you stand by and do nothing?" At last she turned and regarded him. Calvin felt an overwhelming swell of solitude, of melancholy, rush through him. "Something festers at the heart of the council, something that will not die. I thought that perhaps if I had a seat at their table I could find it, make it die. But I couldn't. There are things in this world beyond even my reach, Calvin Lucian." She turned back to the pit. "Perhaps you will fare better. Perhaps not." Delta Command sent another ship to fetch them. Shortly after they boarded, Calvin was approached by Desdemona, who handed him a briefing. "Did you have any trouble?" she asked. Calvin shook his head. "Getting here, getting in." He looked back to where the tower had been. "I can't even see it anymore, like it was never there, and yet—" He reached into his pocket, pulling out the journal. "This guy knew about it a decade ago." The young woman laughed. "Yes, well, I'm sure your mystery agent had his own way with things, just like we need you to have yours. All of our plans are in motion now, Calvin. They all rest on your performing your duty." She nodded in the direction of the absent tower. "With any luck, the rest of them will be as simple as this." Calvin laughed and shook his head. "That's unlikely. We got a good first lick in while they weren't looking, but there won't be any surprise next time." Back. Journal entry. The 13th Overseer. Site 17, Ohio. To the reader. Salutations. I have been things, a well-traveled and member of a certain secret to the work of documenting population from the strange things that inhabit this world. In my travels, I have seen a great many horrors and wonders, and none are perhaps so great and terrible than those individuals who call themselves the overseers of the SCP Foundation. These individuals, who were once men and women themselves have long since abandoned their humanity for the purpose of a pure-minded dedication to a single idea, the study and control of anomalous interactions in the universe. The amount of power they hold is staggering, and in many cases they can be more fearsome, I believe, than the entities they contain. To this end, I have dedicated my life to their study, tracking them and understanding them. This journal is the sum of my research, documenting the strange and unusual characteristics of these fearsome people. I cannot say what you may intend to use this information for, but I hope you find it helpful. All the best. The 13th Overseer. The story of the Overseer's rise to power begins with the individual known as the Other Overseer. Certain occult groups talk about him as if he is a sort of demon, and based on the information available to me, it is hard to deny their reasoning. As this story is told, the Overseers once had access to the Fountain of Youth, a spring of water that would heal ailments and restore life, so long as you drank from it. Despite this, they found the limitations of this process stifling. They could drink and be young forever, but were still subject to death by any number of other means. The Overseers, determined to maintain their legacy perpetually, decided to conduct an occult ritual of their own, one that had been taught to them by the long-since diminished children of the Endless Waste. By bringing a person to the very brink of death and keeping them there, they would be able to summon death itself, who no doubt, seeking to collect the soul, would appear to finish the job itself. It was decided that this would fall to the 13th Overseer, a man named Felix Carter, who prior to his involvement in the Foundation had been a physicist of some renown in certain circles. It is likely that Dr. Carter, of whom little record now exists, was among the first individuals contacted by the person who would later be called the Administrator, when the Foundation was in its infancy. By all accounts, the ritual was performed successfully, and the Avatar of Death appeared before the council to bargain for the man's soul. Instead, the first Overseer proposed a deal: the life of Dr. Carter and his seat on the council in exchange for a stay of mortality for the other members. The extent of these negotiations is unknown, but it is believed that the Overseers were successful in convincing Death to agree to their terms. In order to preserve Dr. Carter's body and protect the structure of their contract, the Overseers had to find somewhere in the world to keep it where it could never be found by another person ever again. I cannot say for certain where Dr. Carter's body is today. However, it is known that there is a location in the South Atlantic, in the cold and dangerous waters, near the Central Islands, where sailors have periodically reported feeling a strange presence, something they could not identify and could not see, something that seemed to impair their very ability to perceive at all. This phenomenon I know well. The sailors, I believe, were suffering iron exposure to a particularly potent anti-meme, something that humans are not capable of perceiving. It is rumored in some circles that in days long past there existed a number of structures around the world that, possibly due to some calamity, were abandoned when their builders were suddenly and quietly snuffed out. These structures, it is said, would have been capable of sustaining similar powerful anti-memes. If this structure would exist, and I believe it very well may, it would only be possible for a human to perceive it under the influence of a drug called mnestic, a powerful psychoactive medicine that alters the way human brains process information. Unfortunately for all those who might be seeking out Dr. Carter's resting place, the entire supply of mnestics the world over is controlled by the very Foundation who put him there. This, I believe, can be of no coincidence. One last point of interest. There was a study conducted years ago by the Coalition to see if they could replicate the effects of mnestics using non-anomalous substances. Nearly all of the trials failed, but one showed promise. Dark rum, if exposed to the sea air, has a very mild mnestic property. The study was cancelled and attempts to replicate the results were unsuccessful. Were it me, I might have considered combining the alcohol with laudanum, which has been known to exacerbate the effects of certain hallucinogens. However, it is perhaps for this reason that there are stories of sailors describing a towering black spire, carved out of the pillars of Pandemonium itself, appearing to them briefly as their ships were thrashed by the uncaring seas. Or it could be nothing. To date, there are no records of any sightings of Dr. Carter since the day he was supposedly given up in exchange for life everlasting. If he still exists somewhere in the world, I would imagine an unknowable, imperceptible prison deep in the world's roughest seas would be the exact place he might be. Should one encounter the Overseer and the Avatar of Death, it should go without saying that extreme caution would be advised. No living man can say how far the grip of death extends. Step 001/12 0512 The Accountant. Previous name unknown. African male, appears to be in his 40s. Well-known figure in financial markets, though rarely spoken of in public, if ever. Dresses in expensive, tailored clothing with similar expensive jewelry. Wears dark glasses. Apparently a mathematical genius, supposedly capable of running the calculations for probability itself in his mind. Likely a novelist's influence. Maintains Foundation financial accounts. Manipulates trade markets in order to accrue wealth for the Foundation and by extension himself. Supposedly has members of his own staff seated at high-level positions on financial boards for all major world governments. Decryption complete. Access log. Chapter 2. Futures Trading. Elsewhere. In a room devoid of light or sound, a man sat at his desk and read. There was a time when the darkness would have impeded him, but that time had passed. Now he found it comforting. Colors distracted him from his work. He turned to the next page of the report, despite not needing to see the words to read them. Old habits, he supposed. With each successive sentence, his calm gave way to cold, calculated purpose. The door opened. A blade of light pierced the room, illuminating the man in his desk. It cut across his forearm and highlighted an old burn scar. He instinctively moved his hand out to cover it. He looked up. A woman stood in the doorway, hesitating. It was only then that he realized his face was twisted with rage. He forced himself to relax, acknowledged her with a nod, and motioned her in. She took 2 steps forward and spoke. "You've heard?" "Yes." He closed the report. "Do we know who yet?" "Not yet." She moved to approach, but stopped as if a wind forced her back. "Whoever found the pinnacle did so with the use of mnestics, and there's a limited supply. We're looking." "And the contract?" The woman didn't respond. He sighed. "Felix?" "We didn't find him. If he fell or was pushed, he might still be falling. We have to assume the worst." The man stood, his eyes fixed on the backs of his own knuckles. "I don't understand how this could happen. I don't understand who would do this, who could do this. Do they even know what they did?" He looked up at her. "This is bad." Her expression did not change. "The rest of the council has been alerted. I just came here to make sure you knew." She took another step forward. Her hand fell to the desk. Maybe if we just..." "Whatever you were about to say, don't." His voice was flat. Something trembled just under the surface. "Whoever they are, they got lucky." She frowned. He could see the weariness in her face. There was something she wanted to tell him. There was something she wanted to say. Instead, she just closed her eyes and nodded. He reached for her hand upon the desk, taking it into his own. His palm was like worn, scraped leather. Hers was ice. "I know you're tired. I know. He forced himself to stop. He took a breath, turned her hand over, and traced the scars along her wrist and forearm. She looked so frail now. "We can't stop now. We can't give up now." Her eyes were still closed. "I know." "Go now. Go back to the garden. You know the way in. You'll be safe there. I'm going to call up the task forces and we'll figure out what this is. I'll call you when it's clear." She squeezed his hand back. At last her eyes opened. "What about you?" He smiled. "I just need to figure some things out and then I'll come for you." He came around the desk and held her. She held him back. After a few moments of silence, she turned her head up to his. The phone rang. He grimaced. His grip on her loosened. "I'm sorry, Her expression hardened. She released him, nodding. "I know." Without another word, she turned and left him alone. He reached for the phone. Now. The Accountant. Anthony found the title amusing. "Do they only have one?" Olivia laughed. That's a lot of math. He must be some sort of uber nerd. A dire nerd, Adam offered, his eyes never leaving the screen of his laptop. The comment drew blank stares from Olivia, Anthony, and Calvin. You know, like a dire wolf from D&D or Game of Thrones or... Adam looked up. He immediately scowled, then went back to typing. You people are old. Anthony took a drag of his cigarette and eyed Calvin from across the room. Alright, so how are you planning on finding all these people? I doubt they're just hanging out at the local pub. They're probably holed up somewhere with enough anomalous ordnance to make Mordor look like the Shire. He gave Adam a look, who, without raising his head, lifted 2 fingers in appreciation. Calvin nodded. Yeah, this is where it gets tricky. Our mystery agent wrote a lot about the overseers and a little bit about where they live, or where they'd be hiding, but a lot of it is situational and might not be helpful. That's why we're going after the accountant first. He's the one who pays the rent. Take him out, and the list of possible safe houses gets that much smaller. Olivia leaned back in her chair. Perfect. We just need to find this first one, then. The first one of these gods on earth know we're coming for them. Do you even have a plan? Calvin gestured to his right. I've got Adam. Adam leaned away from his computer. Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, I can find him. Anthony snorted. This'll be good. Adam ignored him. The accountant is, as far as we can tell, a mathematical prodigy who specializes in statistical analysis. He's a data sponge. He soaks up information, analyzes it, and finds hidden correlations no one else can see. Everything he does based on these invisible relationships. His entire route, what he wears, what he drinks, his day-to-day activities, they're all based on predictions derived from these correlations. He turned his screen around to show the others. Several tabs were open in his browser. The current one was a graph of current stock prices. Now, I probably don't need to tell you what a person like this could do in stock markets. He analyzes data faster than computers. He can predict the boom and bust of a Fortune 500 based on a damn train schedule. And although his ability to see these correlations is anomalous, the correlations themselves aren't. They're just impossible for anyone else to understand or decode. Alright, said Anthony, but that doesn't tell us how to... Train schedules, Olivia cut him off. She was focused on one of the unopened tabs on the screen. In Tokyo? Adam grinned and nodded. He opened the tab, revealing a translated train schedule. The journal mentioned it. I've been having Alexander crunching numbers for a few weeks. Alexander? Anthony narrowed his eyes. It's the name he gave his laptop, Calvin replied. What did you find? Basically, there's some sort of weird correlation between the international housing markets and train schedules printed in Tokyo on the 5th day of every 3rd month, Adam said. And based on how deliberate this guy is, I'd be willing to bet money he goes to Tokyo himself to examine those schedules the day they're printed. Hang on, Olivia leaned in to examine the screen closer. You said this guy is able to make predictions based on correlations no one else can see, right? Wouldn't that lead him to realize he shouldn't be where we expect him to be? Adam cocked his head. Are you asking me if he can see into the future? Well, yeah, isn't that basically what this is? Olivia turned from the screen and focused her attention on Adam. If he's able to magically see connections no one else can, isn't it possible some piece of information he's encountered will tell him that we're coming? Or even who we are? I don't think so, Calvin said. I mean, the numbers can be wrong. Adam shook his head. No, she's, well, mostly right. The numbers can't be wrong. They're just data. He can't know anything for sure, though. He just makes predictions, and those predictions have varying degrees of certainty. That's the hiccup here. He can know there's a 75% chance that today someone will attack him. He can know there's a 30% chance it'll be 5 people, a 25% chance it'll be 4 people, a 20% chance it'll be 3 people, so on. Anthony massages his brows. Look, do we really need to take a probabilities course to kill this guy? I get that he's smart, but last time I checked, train schedules don't stop bullets. But bullets won't stop someone who isn't even there, Olivia replied. She turned back to Adam. So basically, he can predict extremely complex systems based on seemingly random bits of data, right? Adam nodded. Right. Olivia gave them all a very crooked grin. In that case, I think I know exactly how to beat him. The black car pulled to the side of a street in the Tokyo financial district. The man who stepped out was so extraordinarily unremarkable that under normal circumstances, even his lack of remarkability failed to generate a remark. His high-end tailored suit and dark glasses blended with the well-to-dos of the region. His skin was a shade of amber gold. Despite being aware of the time, he checked his wristwatch, closed the car door, then took 3 steps down the sidewalk. The vehicle drove away. The accountant was a man of precision. He slept for exactly 7 hours. When he woke, it was on the hour. Every footfall was calculated, each step predetermined. He made no mistakes, took no chances, and accounted for every significant possibility. That's why, when he first noticed the young man approaching him from across the street, he took immediate action. The man was in his 20s, short hair, open coat, Slavic, if he had to wager a guess. Based on the color of the man's shoes, the accountant determined he was there to kill him. Based on the current market prices of peaches, the accountant determined he was not alone. He took a step to the left. A crowd of businessmen had just emerged from a nearby diner. This put at least 15 people between him and the would-be assassin. One of the 15 was Japanese, in his mid-50s. He walked with a slight limp and was going bald. This meant the second assassin was in the 3rd-story window of the small wine shop across the street. The accountant adjusted his watch, reflecting sunlight off its surface and into the window. The sniper was briefly blinded. Now that neither assassin could see him, he moved to enter a nearby office building. Glare, Anthony growled into his mic. You see him? Adam fought his way through the crowd, shaking his head. No, lost him. He's anticipating everything we're doing. I think he's got to be in that building with the blue glass, heading for it. Olivia peeked out from around the corner and touched her earpiece. Calvin, should I go in with him? There was a brief pause before Calvin replied. Yes. Olivia jogged toward the financial office. Adam pushed his way through several more people to follow her. The interior was a sprawling 3-story lobby framed with marble. A grand staircase extended up to each level, with glass elevators providing an alternate route. Adam's eyes darted between the various levels. Which level? Adam asked. She yanked Adam by the arm and pulled. Neither, this way. The two of them took off toward the far end of the building. An emergency exit led to an alleyway out back. Olivia shoved the door open and stepped through. Adam followed. As soon as they stepped outside, they were greeted with the sound of muffled gunfire. Shit! Olivia shoved Adam between 2 dumpsters. She soon followed him, dropping to a crouch. She flipped out her compact mirror and held it out, using the reflection to search the alley ahead. 2 men in suits stood where the alley emptied out into the street. Between them, the accountant checked his watch. This will work, he announced. We've got about a minute before I leave to catch my train, so what can I do for you? Olivia examined the reflection in her mirror. Adam squinted at the image, frowning. He's just standing out in the open, he whispered. We could just... She reached to touch her earpiece again. Calvin, do we go for it? Calvin's reply came almost immediately. No. Olivia looked at Adam. Keep him talking. Adam nodded. He turned to the side of the dumpster and hollered, You're the accountant, right? You know, I do have a professional title and a name, if you'd rather. We know who you are, Adam yelled back. We're here to kill you. Yes, I'm aware. Well, here I am. Go ahead. Take a shot. Olivia gestured for Adam to keep going. But do you know why we're here to kill you? 29 seconds. You're very likely the ones I received word about just this morning. You're responsible for terminating our contract with death. I presume you want to murder me over some sort of ideological quibble? An ideological quibble? Adam's voice nearly hitched up an octave. Olivia reached to touch his shoulder. You know how many corpses your organization is built on top of? How many people die every day just so you get to run the show? I've never killed anyone. Of course, I'm certain you've killed a few. How many? A dozen? 100? Did you bother to learn any of their names? The accountant asked. He checked his watch again. Were any of them children? Just curious. Adam jerked against Olivia's grip. She squeezed him hard. Don't, she whispered. He's trying to get a rise out of you. Adam growled. His grip on his pistol was tight enough to force the blood out of his knuckles. Like he hasn't killed. Well, if you're not going to try and murder me, I suppose I'll just have to leave early, the accountant said. Again, he looked at his watch. 7 seconds. We're going to miss our chance, Adam hissed. I'm going to. No, Calvin said. Adam was already lunging to his feet, and Olivia was lunging to tackle him. Her arms slammed into his legs, forcing him to buckle. In the next instant, a deafening pop rushed out to fill the alleyway. A fist-sized crater appeared in the dumpster behind them, right where Adam's head had been. Wisps of smoke swirled up from the hole. Adam and Olivia both stared at it, their backs pressed against the other dumpster. Shit, Adam whispered. Sniper, Olivia replied. 1, the accountant announced. Everyone down. Several more pops echoed out through the street, accompanied by distant screams. Olivia and Adam caught the sound of glass shattering. The popping sounds were followed by additional gunfire. Anthony's voice boomed over the earpiece. I'm covering you! Go! Olivia and Adam ran for the door. In the distance, they could hear the sirens, along with the squealing rubber of the accountant's car as it drove away. Sometimes, the accountant wondered what it was like to live in uncertainty, to exist in a world where you could not predict the most likely outcome based on the data in front of you. He imagined it was a dreadful, unbearable state, like being trapped in a nightmare where nothing made sense. The thought often prompted a feeling of tremendous pity. He felt no pity at this moment. As he approached the boarding station, he checked his watch and revisited the alleyway in his mind. He had replayed the events that unfolded there 23 times. Each time, none of it made sense. None of it fit the model. He correctly predicted the arrival of the 2 assassins. He also correctly predicted the arrival of their comrade. But his model had shown that, by standing out in the open and addressing them, there was an overwhelming likelihood that at least one would emerge and be immediately struck down by his stationed sniper. Nothing was truly certain, he knew. Every rule had its exception. Every absolute hid a sliver of doubt. Everything he understood was merely an approximation of something he did not. But the chance of both assassins emerging from this conflict unscathed were, by his calculations, comparable in magnitude to a tornado arranging a deck into a house of cards, then back into the same ordered deck. It was beyond unlikely. It was nothing short of miraculous. Was that what he had witnessed? A miracle of probability? An event as rare and near impossible as the emergence of life itself? He stepped on board the train, providing his ticket. He moved to one of the private rooms, sliding the door aside and taking his seat. As the city began to slip past, he ran through the model for the 24th time, then decided that he would simply need to let it go. The sliding door rattled open. A not quite middle-aged man with dark, faintly graying hair stepped in, taking the opposite seat. He casually reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a revolver, aiming it squarely at the accountant's heart. The accountant stared, uncomprehending. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be possible. 2 miracles in one day? How? He croaked. Calvin reached into his pocket with his other hand, withdrawing a small, unremarkable coin. He perched it on top of his thumb and proceeded to flip it, before snatching it out of the air. He then showed it to the accountant. Tails. The gears in his head started to turn. You're good at predicting complicated systems, Calvin said, but only when they behave the way they're supposed to. You can't predict them if all their decisions are inherently unpredictable. But how did you know I would be? We overheard you say you had a train to catch. There were 2 train stations nearby, so I flipped a coin. The accountant closed his eyes and smiled. How utterly boorish. You got lucky. Yeah, but it worked, didn't it? So it did. His eyes opened. He focused his gaze on Calvin. Well, now you've got me here. What do you want? Calvin laid a piece of paper in front of him and pulled out a pen. He slid them across the table between them towards the accountant. Names, he said. Locations. All of the rest of them. The accountant sighed. You want me to give up the names and locations of the other overseers? What, do you want their PIN numbers too? Calvin tapped the revolver on the table. This probably isn't the time to get smart. The accountant sat back in his chair and loosened his tie. I'm not going to do that. You used a funny trick to put me in a compromising position, and that's clever. But now that we're here, I know exactly how this plays out. Why would I compromise my associates when you're just going to kill me either way? Calvin shrugged. There's a difference between being shot and being dragged behind this train. The other man swallowed. That's barbaric, and either way it's not particularly likely. We're not too far from our destination, and there will be too many people around. The way I die is at the end of that gun. That doesn't bother you? The accountant rolled his tongue across his teeth. Of course it does. I haven't thought about the idea of dying in such a long time. To now be sitting here looking at it, it's nothing short of horrifying. But I'm not going to beg for mercy from a terrorist. He leaned forward. Do you truly understand what it is you're doing? Calvin didn't answer. The overseer sighed. Go ahead. We both know what you're going to do next. Calvin squeezed the trigger. Back. Journal entry. The 12th overseer. The 12th overseer. Note. 12th is spelled with an F, not a V. Learn something new every day. The 12th overseer, often called the accountant, is one of the more interesting personalities on the council. His position on the council was previously held by an unnamed individual who died sometime prior to the signing of their contract with death. After the previous 0512 died, the position was fulfilled almost immediately, leading some to believe that the previous 0512 perhaps didn't die and more was killed, likely to make room for the current 0512's remarkable abilities. 0512, named Omar Uluwe in the earliest record I have found, is nothing short of the world's premier mathematical prodigy. He was born in a small village in Uganda, but quickly distinguished himself for his remarkable gifts. It is thought by many of my sources that his ability to mentally perform complex abstract arithmetic is anomalous, and while that is likely a near certainty, there is no definite proof. The overseer was reportedly employed by a small Ugandan accounting firm in his youth, where he quickly gained a reputation for his ability to perform calculations faster than any calculator. How he was approached by the Foundation and what was offered to him is unknown, but the man named Omar died in 1966, and shortly thereafter, the new overseer took his seat on the council. What is perhaps most unique about the overseer is his ability to perform the calculations required to accurately predict the outcome of seemingly random probability to a nearly flawless degree. Rumors about that it was this ability that truly led the Foundation to dominance, as he was able to accurately predict, by close observation and analysis of market trends, the rise and fall of powerful nations, as well as the actions of other potentially hostile groups. One source indicated that they believed it was he who had first proposed the creation of the Omega-7 Task Force in order to later discredit General Bao and allow the American to usurp his position on the U.S. government Security Council. However, calling his ability omniscient is not accurate. While the overseer can accurately predict the outcome of events that were affected by other events, it is likely that he does not do so well when presented with scenarios that do not have large enough data sets. In other words, he is easily capable of determining the outcome of events with many inputs. He has some trouble with isolated incidents, such as guessing a number one person might be thinking. He's not a mind reader by any stretch of the imagination, even if he seems like one. As for his behavior, the 12th overseer is a reclusive individual and does not eagerly seek out gatherings of people, unlike some of his colleagues. I was on assignment once, undercover at an event, where there were several speakers talking about global market trends and productions. There was one individual I noticed who looked remarkably uncomfortable being there, and as he was not my target, I did not interact with him beyond a friendly smile in passing, which he did not respond. It was not until later that I learned that this man was the accountant. Despite this, he does seem to generally appear in highly populated areas, typically because those areas tend to correspond with active markets, such as New York, London, Hong Kong, and Tokyo. Based on my observation, he generally travels with a small group of armed guards, though I have on several occasions witnessed him traveling alone. I can presume that his retinue was not far behind. The accountant will be a devilishly difficult person to corner, and practically impossible once he knows you're looking for him. If he is aware of your intentions, he will quickly disappear, as was the case when I tried tailing him back to his safe house in Berlin. Shortly afterwards, I was pursued by his guards until I was out of the city, and I have not seen the man since. If you choose to try to ascertain the location of or apprehend the accountant, you must take him by surprise. Otherwise, he will not only outthink you, but he will outplay you as well. The Foundation may keep him around, sour personality and all, to move their money around, but he is no less a dangerous individual than anyone else listed in this document. One last thing. Whether it will be helpful or not, one of my sources believes that he sets his entire routine based on local train schedules, as that is his favorite way to travel, worth considering either way.